Previously on the American Justice Podcast.
I mean, I think they picked up on it too, but unfortunately, the day that oral argument was heard on Mr. Woodruff's case, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals came down with a new decision, the Brooks opinion. And what we had argued is for many years there was a distinction between the standard or burden to prove that a case was legally insufficient and then factually insufficient. And that had been our argument, and that had been my argument throughout the trial, that yes, they've legally proven that somebody murdered the Woodruffs, but the facts are not sufficient to establish that it was Brandon Woodruff.
There is an epidemic in America's criminal justice system: the prosecution and conviction of innocent people for crimes they did not commit. Welcome to American Justice. The American Justice Podcast Army works to free men and women wronged by the criminal justice system. It's not only about the innocent who have been imprisoned, but also the victims of the crimes as well. No one deserves justice more than them. And now, here's your host, Scott Pogensey.
Hello, AJ Army. I can't believe we've reached the end of our time together, at least for the first season. Can you believe that we've been together now for over 8 months, and now 28 recorded episodes? If you add in all of the Q&A episodes and the radio appearances, we're almost to 60. Wow. It's just amazing for me to think about. But I'll leave the reflection and opinions until later in the episode. First, before we even get started, I hope you'll indulge me for just a minute, as I have many thank yous to say and appreciation to express. Let's start with first things first. When I first decided to do a podcast, I knew that I wanted the first case to be Brandon's, but I also knew that sometimes I have a difficult time putting the words in my head down to pen and paper. So I realized, before I even started, that I would need a team of people to help me pull this thing off, to make it the well-oiled machine that you see before you today. When I first met C. Derrick Miller, or Chad as those of us that are privileged enough to be friends with him call him, he was just a guy doing the story about the first screening of my documentary for the Herald Banner in Greenville. However, when I read his story and realized what a great writer he was, I knew I wanted him to be part of my team. Partly because I definitely do not consider myself a writer and needed someone to help fulfill that role, but mostly because I recognized the kind of quality that he was. So I invited him to help me write and put together my thoughts and facts of the case down on paper. And he did just that, exceptionally. Over the past months and now years, he has spent so much of his own time learning about this case, and I could not have asked for a better writing partner. However, the one thing that I didn't see coming was how good of friends we would become. I always try to surround myself with people of exceptional quality, and he definitely fits the bill. So Chad, thank you to the moon and back. I could not have done it without you. I am so excited about all of the upcoming projects, and even more excited to know that I found in you and Sam friends for life. So thank you. The second person I'd like to thank is actually a group of people. These are all wonderful human beings that, much like Chad, I did not know how much they would all become an integral and important part of my life. These people are Brandon's grandmother Bonnie and her husband James, Brandon's former employee Edie Bullock and her husband Randy, Dennis's former co-workers Becky and Lee Wilson, and of course, Brandon's trial attorney, Catherine Ferguson. These wonderful people have helped me so much on the journey to understanding Brandon's case and being able to explain that information to a video documentary and now a podcast audience. Each one of these people have become personal friends and leaders in the crusade to get an innocent man out of prison. Along with all of them, we are leading the fight for Brandon to right the wrong the criminal justice system has done to him. So thank you all from the bottom of my heart. I never will be able to repay you for all of your kindness and generosity. And the last people I'd like to mention and thank are the technical producers that work behind the scenes. Ryan Wall with Wall Studios and Kyan Ransom with Podwiz Productions. I first found Ryan when starting to even come up with the concept of doing a podcast. He's a true professional. He helped me through all the technical aspects of getting started and really brought the complete and hopefully coherent launch of the podcast. Unfortunately, a few episodes in, because of the worldwide pandemic, he had to step back because of some personal situations. So I had to find a new team, and that's when I found Kyan. His production team was able to seamlessly step in and do all the technical stuff that I'm not good at. They master and produce the episodes. They write the show notes or timestamps that you see on YouTube, etc. All kinds of things. They're technical geniuses. So thank you so much to Ryan and Kyan. I look forward to having you guys as part of the team going forward. If I missed anyone, I truly apologize. So many people helped make this podcast and the documentary come to life. I truly could not do it without any of you. So thank you all again so very, very much. All right, let's get started. I just want to kind of give a season wrap up for those of you that have just joined us and haven't listened to the entire season. First of all, why haven't you? It's the most interesting thing you'll listen to all year, at least until season 2 comes out. Okay. Let's wrap up the whole season. Of course, we started the season talking about the fact that 2 innocent people were murdered in their own home. Dennis and Norma Woodruff were nothing less than the typical American couple. Their oldest child, daughter Charla, had just started her 2nd year of college when they were murdered in October of 2005. Their youngest child, Brandon, was a freshman at Abilene Christian University in Abilene, Texas. So there they were, 2 empty nesters looking for direction in life as their attention had pretty much been just on their children, almost since they were married. On the night of Sunday, October 16, 2005, someone entered their house and murdered the couple in their living room. Dennis and Norma were both shot and stabbed multiple times. It was by all accounts a very bloody and gruesome crime scene. A friend of the family, Todd Williams, was called to go check on the couple on the afternoon of Tuesday, October 18th, since no one in the family had heard from either Dennis or Norma since Sunday night. Todd grabbed his friend from work, Ron Merritt, and they headed to the couple's Royce City house. Royce City is located in Hunt County, Texas. Since their youngest child, Brandon, had moved to Abilene to go to college, they were looking for a cheaper house, possibly with some land so they could cut down on the monthly bills. After all, as most of you know, sometimes having children as full-time college students can actually cost more than having small children. Todd and Ron arrived on the scene, noticed both of Dennis and Norma's cars were in the driveway, and instantly got a bad feeling in their stomach. The mobile home was locked, so they did have to gain access to the house via a screwdriver to the window. Once they gained access to the house, They found Dennis and Norma dead on the couch. Todd and Ron would both say that they were not sure how the Woodruffs were killed, but they saw all the blood and just assumed that they were dead. I don't blame them. They didn't search for a murder weapon or anything like that. They just exited the house as fast as possible and called the sheriff's department. If I was them, I wouldn't want to look at my friends covered in blood either. But this fact would be very important later on in the investigation. They sent an officer out who confirmed that indeed they had 2 people dead. Since they would need a search warrant to do any kind of investigation, the deputy left the residence and called for backup. Eventually, there would be all kinds of sergeants and lieutenants and other officers, and riding into town came the cavalry of the state of Texas, the Texas Rangers. Ranger Sergeant Jeffrey T. Collins took the lead in what they call an unnatural death investigation. This term in itself doesn't necessarily mean homicide. It could be a savage animal attack, could have been a double suicide, could have been a few different things. But the fact that there was so much blood present led the investigators to believe that it was not a double heart attack or anything like that. So the Texas Rangers led the investigation into the unnatural deaths. They were present the whole time the potential crime scene was being processed. Ranger Jeff Collins directed the sheriff's office deputies when they were going to document the crime scene via video to turn off all of the lights. Between the time they found the bodies and the time they decided to video the crime scene, the sun had gone down. We don't know exactly what time the processing of the crime scene began because in parts of the lights out video, you can see that Lieutenant Janie Simpson's laptop was already in the house. So all we know is that they were in the house for a while before they decided to start filming. What exactly happened in the time between the initial access and the filming? What evidence did the investigators contaminate by knocking over or knocking into? Or, if you think in a more nefarious manner, like I do, what evidence did they manipulate or plant? We'll never know because, as you'll learn soon enough, the investigation into the crime was full of blunders, missteps, and outright manipulation. Once they were done processing the first night, the investigators had the bodies of Dennis and Norma transported to the Southwest Institute of Forensic Sciences in Dallas, Texas, to have the autopsies performed. Once the autopsy was done, Detective Joel Gibson got a message from dispatch. Some lady had called in and said she had information about the, quote, Woodruff murders, unquote. This lady had first called with a star 67 as to hide her identity, but eventually called back to have dispatch give her name and number to the lead investigator in the case. That lady was the mother of one of Brandon's friends named Norma Etherington. When Detective Gibson called Miss Etherington back, she first asked if they had any suspects. When he told her that they did not, she immediately offered up information that the couple's son Brandon was a liar, had an alternative lifestyle, and was known to be violent. I can only imagine what the conversation was like on the ride back to Greenville between Ranger Collins and Detective Gibson. It seems like Norma's plan had worked, and they finally started to develop their first suspect, and what would come later to be known as their only suspect, Brandon Woodruff. After all, their visit to the autopsy just confirmed what they were already thinking. This was indeed a double homicide. Over the next few days, Ranger Collins headed the investigation that would find a couple of interesting things. First, they were able to determine the death window. Norma Woodruff had been on the phone with her mother, Opal Johnston, until about 9:30 p.m. That was the last time that anyone heard from the Woodruffs. And since they were both supposed to be at work the next morning at 8 a.m., and neither of them showed up, this led the investigators to believe that they were killed between 9:30 p.m. and 8 a.m. Now, Does this mean for sure that they were actually dead at this time? No, of course not. They could have been held hostage or something similar. Either way, the investigators believed they had their murder window. Next, it was relayed to Ranger Collins by some of the family members that Brandon was saying that he had left the Dallas area on Sunday night right after having dinner with his parents around 7 p.m. Only problem with that? A neighbor of the Woodruffs' first house over in Heath, Texas, said that he saw Brandon between 10 and 11 p.m. Wow, that's a lot different than the 7 p.m. that he was claiming to his family. Sounds like their number one and only suspect just got a lot hotter. That Sunday, Brandon traveled to Hunt County with his aunts Cathy and Linda and his sister Charla to be interviewed by the Texas Ranger and detective with the sheriff's office. Linda, Cathy, and Charla went first. Lots of good background information from Cathy and Linda, and lots of crazy talk from his sister Charla. Just watch it. You'll see. Anyway, when they got to Brandon, of course their number one reason for being there was to get Brandon pinned down on his timeline. He told them exactly where he went that night. Dinner with his parents, ran by the horse barn, over to the Heath house to feed the animals and let the parrot out of his cage. Then on to Denny's to pick up Robert, over to Alex's house, and down to the dance club. Then Brandon said he took his friends back home to Alex's house and headed back to Abilene with his friend Robert. Every single thing that Brandon told them he did that night was verified, independently. The only problem? Ranger Collins set Brandon to a timeline of leaving the Heath house by 8 p.m. Then, not knowing really what time he left the Heath house, Brandon agreed. Once Ranger Collins had Brandon agreeing to this arbitrary time, he lowered the boom.
Brandon, that's the first thing that he told you is, whatever you tell him, you need to tell him the truth.
Right, no,
right?
That's the truth, and I don't know how you're saying that there's
Well, there's huge inconsistencies I'll tell you right now, I've got an eyewitness that saw you in Heath at 11 p.m. on Sunday night. Between 10 and 11 p.m. at the Heath residence, and you're putting yourself at a club in Dallas or at Alex's home, leaving between 11 and 11:15, and Brandon, let me tell you, it's impossible. You can't be. That's our question.
But what
you
my
can't be two places.
Is, how can three of my friends say that I was with them?
You know what? We haven't talked to your friends
We're going
yet.
to.
But here's the thing, Brandon, okay, you threw out before over in Heath, man, I know all my neighbors and all my neighbors know me. And I'm telling you right now that a neighbor has contacted us and said on Sunday night, and I know it was Sunday night, and I know it was between 10 and 11 p.m., that's as far as I can get it narrowed down, I saw Brandon at the Heath address. And now all of a sudden, You've told us this whole story about where you are and where you should be, and that's the question that we've got. How can you be two places at once?
So Ranger Collins thought he had Brandon caught in a lie. Did it ever creep into Ranger Collins' thick skull that Brandon might be a typical teenager? Did it ever occur to him that Brandon might just be irresponsible with time? That he might not even know what time he left the Heath house? Only because that's what Brandon told him? But no, Ranger Collins thought he had Brandon caught in a bold-faced lie. And as I said in one of the past episodes, I believe it was right then and there that Ranger Collins cemented in his brain that Brandon was the one that brutally slaughtered Dennis and Norma Woodruff. And everything that he was going to do from there on out was to prove that Brandon was a cold-blooded killer. So as soon as Brandon left the sheriff's office, Ranger Collins returned to his office to start working on the arrest affidavit. You might have heard me or other guests on the show use the terms arrest affidavit and arrest warrant interchangeably. That's not exactly accurate, but just as we're not all attorneys, we're not all police officers either. The affidavit is what the police officer writes in order to submit to the judge to get an actual warrant. So Ranger Collins takes the affidavit to Judge Leonard, and for some reason, Judge Leonard signed off on it. Now, as I just stated, I'm not a professional law enforcement officer, but as a layperson, I always thought you had to have proof to arrest someone. Like proof, not just speculation, not just innuendo, and not just suspicion. And proof is one thing that Ranger Collins was lacking in. Remember the Ranger Collins top 10 list? We went through every single thing that Ranger Collins used in the arrest affidavit. In case you haven't caught up to us completely, let's name them, David Letterman style. Number 10. The murders were personal. All of the attacks were aimed at the neck and throat of the victims, leading them to believe the suspect was enraged at Dennis and Norma Woodruff. Number 9. The murderer felt comfortable. Through the use of luminol, it was discovered that there was a trail of blood leading from the living room area to the bathroom and the front of the bathroom. Number 8. Brandon was the last person known to have seen Dennis and Norma Woodruff alive. Number 7. The neighbor to the Heath house stated that he had witnessed Brandon at the home between the hours of 10 p.m. and 11 p.m. on the night of the murders. Brandon was off on his times. Number 6. Brandon stated that he was not going back to school in Abilene and had no intentions of returning to the Rockwall/Hunt County area. Number 5. Brandon had access to the missing gun from the Lee household. Number 4. Brandon was having trouble in school. He had stated to Michelle Lee that he was worried about failing out of school and that his missing curfew so many times was certain to get him expelled. Number 3. Brandon was violent towards animals. Both Michael Etherington and Michelle Lee claimed to have knowledge that Brandon was abusing animals. Number 2. Michael Etherington claimed that Brandon Woodruff had changed his answers on a MySpace survey involving his feelings about his parents. At one time, Etherington stated that Brandon said he, quote, hated his fucking parents and wished they were fucking dead, end quote. When the investigators actually took time to view the MySpace page, they saw that it stated that he loved his parents. And now, the number one reason why Brandon killed his parents? Charla's statements regarding the family dynamic. According to Charla's interview, her father and brother were abusive to her, and Brandon had asked that she lie for him several times during their upbringing. So there you have it. That's what Ranger Collins used to arrest a 19-year-old boy and incarcerate him for the rest of his life. I think it's important to differentiate between evidence and proof. Evidence can be rumors or innuendo or hearsay, etc. If I came to you and said, "See, Derrick Miller stole my car," that's evidence. If I came to you and said, "See, Derrick Miller stole my car, and here's a video of him getting into it and driving off with me running behind him yelling, 'No, man, no, don't steal my car," that would be proof. As you can see, Ranger Collins had evidence, but no proof. Maybe we should start requiring proof to actually take someone's freedom away. Hey, there's a novel idea. All right, so Brandon was arrested the next day after being interrogated by Ranger Collins. From that point on, there was at least a faint showing of some kind of investigative effort. Sure, Ranger Collins talked to Brandon's friends, his enemies, his church friends, his school friends, his family, his. Did you notice that? Everything that Ranger Collins did, literally everything, was centered around Brandon and evidence against him. Only one time did he get outside of this little circle and talked to the barn guy that Brandon thought was supposed to meet his parents the night that they were murdered. But what was the only reason that he was there to meet with them? So that they could say, no, Brandon's lying. I wasn't supposed to meet with Dennis. That's it. Everything centered around proving Brandon a monster. So the day after Brandon was arrested, Ranger Collins called one of Brandon's shit-kicker friends, Mike Etherington, into the sheriff's office so they could finally get his statements on a video recording. However, in the one and only time that I ever saw Ranger Collins, I believe, start to doubt himself, he started to get the feeling that Mike was not being honest with him. Mostly because Mike just flat out lied to him. He told the investigators that he saw Brandon's MySpace page, and it said Brandon hated his fucking parents and wanted them to fucking die. His words, not mine. I do find it quite interesting that we know now that Mike completely made this up. And when he did make it up, he had to add the emphatic curse words to it. It wasn't enough to just say Brandon said on his MySpace page that he hated his parents and wished they were dead. No, he had to add the expletives. That kind of language just wasn't Brandon. Hell, the most mad we ever saw Brandon was when Ranger Collins said to him, "So you're telling us that you didn't murder your parents?" And Brandon replied, "No, that's fucking crazy." But then immediately followed it with, "Excuse my language. If someone ever accused me of murdering my parents, I wouldn't be asking for forgiveness for using some colorful four-letter words." But Brandon did, because he was just that kind of good kid. So after Mike got off the Ranger Collins hot seat with only a few burn marks from Satan's pitchfork, next, a day later, was Sister Charla's turn. Maybe she was the one holding the pitchfork. Who knows? But we all know now that she came into this second time in the interview room with a completely different agenda. Within just a few seconds, she immediately pointed the finger at Brandon as the killer. And the rest of the interview was nothing more than that. Well, that and some off-the-wall crazy ramblings about home dude and homegirl and, oh yeah, the KKK. So after about 6 months, Ranger Collins finally got the phone records. He got the phone records for Mike, Charla, Brandon, Dennis and Norma, Morgan Lee, and Brandon's friends Alex and Robert. And that was it. There were so many other people in this little web that it would have been nice to see their phone records. Let's start with Norma Etherington. Remember, the morning after the bodies were found, she called the sheriff's office with that star 67 several times. How many times was it? I'd like to know. Wouldn't you? How about fellow shit-kicker Joe Hagaman? We know how many times he called Mike and Charla and Brandon. But did he try to call the Woodruffs home the night the bodies were found? Did he have 0 calls from 9:30 at night until 2 a.m. the night of the murders? All things Ranger Collins dropped the ball on. And of course, there's the 14 hours missing in Brandon's phone records on the day of the murders. I'll get to my opinion on those 14 hours when I get to my opinion on the case, but for now, we just know that 14 hours are missing. So after this, Ranger Collins gets a promotion and a pat on the back for railroading a gay teenager and moves up to Lubbock, Texas. And with that, the investigation is pretty much complete. Until it turns out that the Assistant District Attorney, Kelly Aiken, for some godforsaken reason, decided it would be a good thing to order an inmate's phone calls between him and his attorney. I'm not sure how she still has a bar card, but she does. Oh, and now she's a judge, a district court judge at that, which means that she deals with constitutional issues on a regular basis. Maybe she just didn't read the Sixth Amendment in law school, or maybe she was out sick on the day they covered it. I'm not really sure, but she definitely ordered the phone records, and it was a big deal. And Judge Beacom said it wasn't a big deal. He would just not allow any evidence in that was gained from the recordings. This would be the equivalent of you getting caught with 10 kilos of cocaine in your trunk, and the cop pulls you over and says, "Okay, you can go about your way, but I'm just going to keep this cocaine. Hurry on now." Why wouldn't you get in trouble for something so egregious? Why didn't she? We'll never know. So then, 2.5 years after Brandon was arrested, Brandon's Aunt Cathy somehow finds something that she didn't find the other 6 times that the barn was searched. The magic dagger, or sword, or knife, whatever you want to call it. There were so many suspicious things about this sword that I will just touch on a few of them. Brandon's friend, Derrick Gentry, said the dagger was about 10 to 12 inches in length a couple of weeks after the murders. This weapon was almost 2 feet long. The state contended it was bought at medieval times. When I contacted Medieval Times, they said, "No way, Jose." Then I contacted the horse trainer, Marcial Contreras, that Brandon worked with there, and he said, "No way, Jose." Why does everyone keep calling me Jose? My name is Scott. Okay. So then the state's medical examiners concluded it was not likely the murder weapon, but it could have been. But then Brandon's more qualified medical examiner came in and said, "No way, Jose." Oh, geez, not this again. So we were able to conclusively prove that this sword was not Brandon's and was not the murder weapon. Case closed on that. We all know how the trial went. It didn't go well for Brandon. With the homophobic jury that was seated in this small town, Brandon didn't have a chance. As soon as they heard the word gay, it was game over. Brandon was convicted in March of 2009. Several appeals later, including the one about the unethical Sixth Amendment violation, and nothing was done. All of the courts either referred it to a higher court or just flat out refused to hear the appeal. So here we sit. Brandon Dale Woodruff, barring some kind of miracle, will sit in prison for the rest of his natural life. It's not fair, and it's not right. And that's a perfect segue into the last part of the first season of the American Justice Podcast. My head writer, C. Derrick Miller, and I will wrap up the season with exactly what we think of what happened to Dennis and Norma. If all you want to hear about is the case and the facts, then I would suggest you stop now. For you, the season is over. Thank you for listening, and please remember to get involved when you see injustices in the world. For those of you still with me, here we go. First, let's hear from C. Derick. When he first sent me over this recording, I listened to it and my jaw dropped. I knew that he had been thinking kind of some of the things that he talked about here, but just wait until you hear the complete thing. It's gonna blow your socks off. So without further ado, here is C. Derrick Miller and how he feels about the Brandon Woodruff capital murder case.
Okay. For months now, people have asked me for my personal opinion on the Brandon Woodruff case. I mean, I co-write the American Justice Podcast. I worked for the Hunt County Sheriff's Department for over a decade. I know several of the officers involved and even interacted with Brandon personally while he was incarcerated. On top of that, I've read and studied every single document involved with this case. Who better to formulate an opinion on this case other than me? The only kicker is, I didn't want to point fingers. We already know that Brandon didn't kill Dennis and Norma, so that means the real killer or killers is still out there, somewhere. I wouldn't want to piss this person or these people off by revealing my true feelings on this case. I'm not a hard person to find. As a novelist, my personal information is all over the internet, whether it be my website or one of my social media accounts. We live in the age of information, right? Anyone with half a brain could probably figure out my personal phone number or address with all the information available to them. Fortunately, I'm one of those Texans who has a license to carry a handgun, and I do. Kind of pointless to take the class and pay the fee if you're not going to strap that smoke wagon to your waist every time you hit up the grocery store. Right? Am I right? That being said, I wouldn't hesitate to splatter that previously mentioned half-brain all over the sidewalk if trouble were to ever come looking for me. I mean, my wife carries too. One of us would get you for sure. So without further hesitation, here is a fiction writer's opinion of the Brandon Woodruff case. First of all, many of the investigators, deputies, and jailers at the Hunt County Sheriff's Office were a bunch of hornballs back when this case was a hot ticket, between the years of 2005 and 2009. I left in 2013, so I can't speak from personal experience whether or not they changed, but no one ever truly changes, do they? Not in my experience. Back then, everyone was screwing everyone else. They were doing each other's wives, witnesses, family members who would come for visitation, and even inmates. I know this all for a fact. I even witnessed some of it with my own eyes. Now, being the tubby bastards that some of them were, they'd take anything they could get. Hell, most of those guys couldn't have gotten laid if they crawled up a chicken's ass and waited. Charla Woodruff was not an ugly chick in 2005. While watching some of the interviews where she's involved, I picked up on nods, voice fluctuations, tone, and general attitude between herself, Ranger Collins, and Investigator Jones. These things I noticed are not shared with anyone else interviewed during the case, just her. If this is true at all, I'm not saying Charla Woodruff would have been a bad person for doing so. I mean, you got to get in where you fit in, right? Two powerful men who both sit in a position she dreams of being in. She wanted to be an investigator more than anything. Plus, they're not bad-looking dudes either. Not my type, but not bad-looking dudes. To them, I'm sure she was a goddess, and there was no way they would have turned down advances. Hell, those badge boys couldn't turn down the half-toothed smiles of the cashiers of the convenience stores in Hunt County, so they sure as hell weren't going to turn down Charla Woodruff. Now, her life was destined to get a whole lot better if her brother was safely tucked away inside the penitentiary, right? I've thought this since the very beginning of my research into this case. Charla was suspect number one, and the investigators helped her get away with it. Again, this is the opinion of a fiction writer, so take it where you wish. After all, you can't spell charlatan without Charla. My runner-up theory, which I didn't formulate until after writing the episodes of the American Justice podcast, involves Morgan Lee. Morgan's parents, Mike and Michelle, were terribly busy people and very rarely home. With Brandon away at college, Morgan was having a field day with the shitkickers, Mike Etherington, Joe Hagaman, and Dusty Perry. I mean, being best friends and all, and fake lovers in front of the people who mattered, she had to have known Brandon was gay. Their relationship was a total front. Did she love him? Absolutely. In a physical way? Not at all. But people have needs. Morgan was an attractive girl, and the shitkickers were horn dogs just like the Hunt County Sheriff's Office deputies. Now, I'm not saying that Morgan was taking them all on or even screwing any of them, but that didn't stop those boys from wanting to. They were constantly around her and more than likely visited the Lee home more times than what Morgan's parents knew about. I was a teenage boy once upon a time myself, and I know how this shit works. Brandon's friends all claim that he had sex with Morgan on the weekend in question. I mean, I can't imagine a gay teenager would make something like that up. A heterosexual encounter during his coming out process? So there has to be some truth in it at some point. Maybe Brandon was going to give heterosexuality one last try before fully committing to what both you and I know was the eventual outcome. This pissed the shit kickers off. Their love interest had been tarnished by the gay kid from high school who they already hated with a passion. Upon finding out, in a jealous rage, One or all of them traveled to Brandon's house, not knowing he had already left to go take care of the animals and go clubbing. Norma and Dennis let them in without thinking twice because they'd all known each other for years. And because villains loved a monologue, they began spilling the beans on what Brandon had been up to, and the Woodruffs got upset. There was a confrontation, things got out of hand, and there you have it. Double homicide. After all, you can't spell Morgan without organ. Okay, that's reaching, and nowhere near as clever as charlatan and Charla, but still. Then Norma Etherington helped her son Mike clean it all up. The family that slays together stays together. So there you have it. Both my main theory and my runner-up theory both revolve around sex. It's a powerful thing, and it makes people do some really stupid stuff. I've done tons of ignorant things over the years for it, but never hurt anyone but myself. Over and over and over again. If you binge watch episodes of Snapped, you'll agree that sex and love are the number one causes of homicide on this planet. Not trucks, not scholarships, sex. I may be completely off base with all this thinking, and like I said, I'm a fiction writer. My mind automatically jumps to the craziest outcome of any situation. But what if I'm right? This was a line of thinking no one went in during the investigation. If it were truly the case, wouldn't it make sense? Anyway, I'm C. Derrick Miller. Thank you for listening to the American Justice Podcast, and keep your private parts to yourselves. If used incorrectly, it has the potential to cause bad things to happen. Not in the moment, of course, but in the long run.
Wow. Just wow. So what did you guys think? I'd love to hear from you in the comments. All right. So now, the time you've all been waiting for. But first, we need to get a couple of disclaimers out of the way.
The opinions expressed in this episode of the American Justice Podcast are just that, opinions of the host, and there is no representation of fact being expressed or inferred. Listen at your own risk. Like, seriously, if you don't want to know what Scott thinks happened, then don't listen any further. Okay, here we go.
When I first started this podcast, I made a promise to myself to try and tell just the story as much as possible without interjecting my opinion too much. However, as I soon realized, doing that and still trying to keep the story entertaining proved very difficult. I mean, after all, who wants to tune in every week just to hear me sit here and read off facts? You can read the trial transcript if you're that bored. But I came to you every week and told you the facts in hopefully an entertaining way, and interjected my pure opinion only once in a while with my patent-pending Scott Pogency personal opinions. Well, for one final time this season, here we go again.
And now, it's time for a patent-pending Scott Pogency personal opinion.
In my journey for the fight for freedom for Brandon Woodruff, I am often asked about what my theory of the case is. After all, I have studied the facts of the case more than probably anyone, and several things stand out that just cannot be denied. First, let's start with the investigation. You cannot tell me that so-called professional investigators could ever make so many mistakes. From the word go, filming the crime scene with the lights off, these idiots were walking around in the dark, knocking things over, contaminating the crime scene with no foot booties, and most of them wore no gloves, etc. And then you can hear in the video when they find a laptop bag, one of the investigators says, "Oh, there's a laptop," and the other investigator says, "No, that's Janie's." They're referring to Lieutenant at the time, Janie Simpson. So that proves that at some point before they started filming, the detectives were up in that crime scene. So that begs the question, not only what did they unintentionally contaminate, but what did they intentionally manipulate? After all, why would they film the crime scene after the detectives have already been in there working? Wouldn't it be smart to film it, lights on or not, before anyone set up their laptop and starts working? So if they were in there working before the filming started, what did they change? No one can answer that but them. But I believe very early on, they were convinced that it was a crime of passion. Why? Because no locks were jammed, no doors were broken, and there was no sign of forced entry. So automatically they thought, okay, this is someone that knows them. Then they saw the way that Dennis was sitting on the couch. For those of you that have not seen the crime scene photos, you're lucky. They're not pretty. Dennis was basically just sitting there like nothing was wrong, except for the bullet in his brain. But the position of his body was pretty much what you or I would look like if we were just sitting on the couch, except for the fact that his head tilted back and his eyes were staring up to the ceiling. So this led the investigators to believe that not only did someone have access to the home, but it must have been someone that they knew and that attacked them while they were sitting peacefully on the couch. From day one, this bothered me. First, just so everyone knows, I'm not a forensic crime scene analyst, so I can't go in there and study things like the expert that I hired could. But it bothered me because they were making so many assumptions from the way that the bodies ended up. Lots of things could have happened between the time that they were confronted and the time that they were ultimately killed. This is what bothered me about assuming the Woodruffs were killed between 9:30 and 10:30 p.m. Yes, the last time they were known to be alive via the phone call to Norma's mom Opal was 9:30 p.m. But the next time that they were truly unaccounted for was the next morning when they didn't show up to work. Yes, we all know that Charla called them at 11 p.m. and they didn't answer, but don't get me started on Charla. I'll get to her in a minute. But how do we know that they were not held hostage? How do we know that the killers were not trying to formulate a plan and held the two at gunpoint? Okay, so this brings me to something else that pisses me off about this case. Ranger Collins said in several of the different interviews, and even in his investigative report, that there was no struggle. Dennis and Norma were caught by surprise and shot without warning. Okay, first of all, asshole, you don't know that. You can't say that as a fact. You can give your opinion that that's what happened. But unless you were there, you can't say that as a fact. Several times, Ranger Collins said, quote, "There wasn't a struggle." That is completely disingenuous in the first place because there were so many signs of a struggle with Norma. But let's leave Norma out of it for now. Let's talk about just Dennis. Let me give you a scenario. The perpetrators knock on the door. It's late, probably 10-ish or so. Dennis and Norma come to the door, look out and see that it's someone they casually know, and they open the door. There are words exchanged, and ultimately the new visitors pull a gun and force their way inside. They order the couple to sit on the couch at gunpoint. It's going to look like there wasn't a struggle because the Woodruffs did what they were told. There's a crazy person holding a gun to them. Of course they're going to do what they're told. Now, let's say that these new unwanted visitors are expecting Brandon to be home. I'll get to why I believe this to be the case in just a few moments. So they ask the Woodruffs, "Where is Brandon?" Dennis and Norma tell them, "Well, he's not here. He's gone back to college." Now what are they going to do? They're expecting Brandon to be here, and he's not. It would make perfect sense for them to put one person in front of Dennis and Norma with the gun pointed at them while the others had to sit there and try to figure out the new plan. So now, Dennis and Norma are just sitting there at gunpoint, thinking to themselves, what the hell are we going to do? One thing that we touched on just a little bit this season was that Dennis was shot at very close range. They estimated between 6 and 12 inches away. Also, the trajectory of the bullet was so precise. I mean, it entered almost right in the center of his head. So in my opinion, it had to have been steadied. If there's a struggle, or even if someone just runs up on you real quick and pulls out a gun, anyone's first reaction is going to be to turn your head. So I believe that if Brandon had done what the investigators claimed that he had done and just ran up on Dennis real quick with a gun, Dennis would have turned his head in some way. And when you're attacking someone like that, the adrenaline going through your system is going to make you super anxious and unable to focus or point completely accurately. So the fact that the bullet was so close and so exact in its angle, to me makes more sense that someone is just sitting there with the gun to his head, telling him, "You had better not fucking move, man." And then, with Dennis completely still and frightened out of his mind, the gun goes off. Possibly accidentally, and possibly on purpose. But it's for these reasons I believe the person that killed Dennis had him at gunpoint, ordering him not to move. Ranger Collins is correct that it was not a struggle with Dennis, but it was also not a surprise ambush. Next, we turn our attention to Norma. Why was Norma so oddly positioned on the couch, and why were there so many more signs of a struggle with her? A bullet through the back of her hand as she tried to shield herself, strange hairs in her right hand, the one with the bullet hole in it, etc. Because she saw what just happened to her husband and freaked out. That's why. If you were sitting on a couch with your significant other at gunpoint, and the person just shot your partner, what would you do? I certainly wouldn't just sit there like a bump on a log. I'd start freaking out and fighting back too. So I agree with the investigators that it was probably someone they knew, at least casually, in order to get in the house. But I disagree that it had to be someone that knew them so intimately that they would have been caught by surprise. All right. So you might be wondering why I believe the killers thought Brandon was in the house at the time. I've mentioned this a few times throughout the Q&A episodes, but never really gave my theory until now. Let's talk for a second about what we know Brandon did that weekend. He came into town Friday afternoon. He went to Denton to drop Robert off, and then he went to his parents' house to say hi and check in. Dennis and Norma had 2 cars and a truck. They drove the cars every day and kept the truck parked in front of the horse trailer at the Heath house so that no one would steal the trailer. Norma knew that she did not need her car for the weekend because she would be with Dennis the whole time. Since Brandon's truck that he drove was in such disrepair, or as Jerry Spencer Davis would say, ramshackle condition, Norma let him borrow her car for the weekend. Well, Saturday night, there was an incident at the local Chick-fil-A. Brandon was with Morgan Lee, and they ran into a couple of the shitkickers, Mike Etherington and Joe Hagaman. As we all know by now, there was no love lost between the 3 of them at this point, and there was something about seeing Brandon with Morgan that made Mike snap. He started yelling at Brandon, and ultimately, when Brandon took Morgan and left, Mike followed them and ended up trying to run them off the road. Well, again, Brandon was in Norma's car. That's a very important point. So let's fast forward one night. On Sunday night, the killers show up and see Norma's car and assume that Brandon is in the trailer. So that is the perfect segue into my theory on the case. Before we get to who I believe committed these crimes, let's just close out the case and all agree that it could not have been Brandon. I'm about to discredit every theory the prosecution had. First, Brandon was running up debt, needed money, had no place to turn but his parents' life insurance. I know we haven't talked a lot this season about the adult movies that Brandon had done, so let me give you the details now. Brandon had starred in 6 different, quote, scenes for one company. 3 of those were in Dallas, and 3 were in Florida when the company flew him out there. Brandon was considered a hot commodity in the gay porn industry. He was skinny, good looking, and let's just say he knew how to perform. I don't want to turn this podcast from R-rated into X-rated. So for just 2 weekends of work, Brandon was paid well over $5,000. And the invitation for him to come back and film more scenes was always there. If Brandon needed money, he could have flown to Florida for a weekend and come back with more money than he needed for a few months. So the notion that Brandon killed his parents because of money is just nothing but bullshit. All right. Next, the state alleged that Brandon did not want to tell his parents that he was flunking out of school. If every college freshman that was struggling in their first year killed their parents, we'd have no parents left. Besides, Dennis and Norma knew Brandon was struggling. The college was real big on keeping parents involved in their students' lives, especially the freshmen. So this was no surprise to Dennis and Norma. It's just as absurd as it is ridiculous. Grasping at straws much? Okay, so they also said that Brandon didn't want to tell them that he was gay. This is almost as ridiculous as the first 2. There were so many witnesses, not just a couple, but many that said that Dennis already knew Brandon was struggling with his sexuality and he thought he was gay. This would have been no surprise to either of them. And Brandon was pretty comfortable in his sexuality at this point. I mean, I've never starred in gay porn, and most of you at this point probably know why. But if I had, I would have to assume that eventually my parents are going to hear about it from someone. So Brandon was not exactly the secluded and closeted gay man that the state wanted you to think he was. After all, the day that he interviewed with Ranger Collins, he told Ranger Collins that he went to S4, a gay club. It was not Brandon's fault that Ranger Collins didn't know it was a gay club. At least, that's what he says. Oh yes, and last, the goddamn truck. This one is so outrageous, I feel bad for even commenting on it. Remember, Brandon was spoiled by his parents. They gave him pretty much anything he wanted. In fact, there were several people that said yes, Brandon drove that truck all the time. And Norma was planning on giving him that truck once they could sell his old junker. That's why Brandon ended up leaving his junker behind that weekend and going out with his mom's truck. He needed the reliability, and his parents were going to try and sell his truck. He had absolutely no motivation to kill his parents at all. Also, we've been able to show you forensically that it's just not possible that Brandon killed his parents. Remember the 14-minute time frame that was, quote, unaccounted for? Yeah, anyone that thinks that a 19-year-old kid could do everything the killer needed to do in just 14 minutes is absolutely insane. A trained and experienced assassin couldn't do it in 14 minutes. And speaking of the phone records, let's talk about when Ranger Collins got the phone records, some 6 months after Brandon was in jail. Remember those 14 hours that were missing? What do you think Ranger Collins thought of this? Well, he says that he just chalked it up to Brandon just didn't make any or receive any calls from 8:50 a.m. until 10:46 p.m. However, remember that he talked to Robert and he talked to Alex. They both told Ranger Collins that they were in constant contact with Brandon all throughout the day. He knew Brandon was making and receiving calls that day. So if this truly was just the records are missing, then why didn't he go back and try to find them? Go back to the phone company. Hey guys, there's 14 hours missing here on a critical day of me solving these murders. Where are they? Nope, he says he just assumed that Brandon wasn't making or receiving calls. It's for this reason, and a few others, that I believe Ranger Collins, and Deputy Marshal Kirk King deliberately deleted these phone calls from the record. It's not a coincidence that it was just one day with 14 hours missing. It's not a coincidence that it just happened to be the day of the murders. It's not a coincidence that it happens to contain a phone call that would completely exonerate Brandon. There's no coincidence here. Ranger Collins knew that information would exonerate Brandon and deliberately deleted it. He altered the records and fucked over Brandon for the rest of his life. So that leads us up to the real subject. Who actually did it? In talking with other people that know the case very well, we always try to come up with different scenarios as to who it could have been that killed Dennis and Norma. We explore other options, such as the fence guy or the barn guy, or possibly drug dealers in the neighborhood. Or hell, sometimes we even talk about maybe it was home dude or home girl or the KKK. But every bit of evidence always leads us right back to 5 people: Norma Etherington, Mike Etherington, Joe Hagaman, Dustin Perry, and Charla Woodruff. We have to go back to the beginning to understand why these people had motivations or reasons for killing these innocent people. First of all, I believe this whole thing started because of Charla. Her hatred for her dad was immeasurable. Dennis was the one that signed the paperwork that involuntarily committed Charla to the loony bin over and over again. I can only imagine what her crazy mind was thinking about the whole time she was locked up with all those other insane people plotting against the man that put her there. We very specifically went over her psychiatric history very carefully so that all of you would understand exactly how sick she really was. And I don't mean sick in a physical way. I mean sick in an insane way. And kudos to the doctors back then for recognizing her homicidal tendencies when they made her sign paperwork that said that she would not harm herself or her family before they let her leave. But as she grew up, I believe that hatred just manifested itself until finally, I believe she found someone that she was close enough with that also had a reason to off the Woodruffs: Norma Etherington. We all know at this point that Norma Etherington and Norma Woodruff were basically enemies. So when her adopted daughter, Charla, comes to her with a plan to kill Dennis and Norma, the seeds were planted. I believe that they were allowed to grow, and Norma Etherington thought about this a lot. I believe that she took this newfound fact that Charla wanted her parents dead as well as a green light to hatch a plan and make it happen. So she thought about it, and eventually a feasible plan was born. A way to take out the problem Woodruffs and leave their golden child, Charla. They would kill Dennis and Norma, and the life insurance money would be enough to set them all up for a long time. But what about Brandon? With Brandon in the picture, Charla would have to split the money 50-50. Aha! We'll get Brandon too. Then 100% of it would be theirs to split. But she couldn't do it herself. She needed help. Her son Mike was the perfect accomplice. He hated Brandon after all, so why not? He probably didn't scoff at the notion of splitting the newly inherited honeypot either. I don't think that Mike felt comfortable with just him and his mom in on it either, so I think he recruited Joe and Dustin to help as well. Normally I would say that he just recruited Joe, but there were witnesses that spotted a vehicle just like the one that Dustin drove down the road on the night of the murders. So I believe that he was a lookout and made sure that there weren't any red or blue lights coming their way. And then, suspiciously enough, he sold that vehicle just a couple weeks after the murders. But Joe? Perfect accomplice, crazy and stupid, and a complete follower that Mike had under his cult leaderish control. So there we have it. All the players are recruited. But when could they do it? It's hard to know when they would all be together. Remember what I just told you a few minutes ago about Mike seeing Brandon in his mom's car? I believe that Mike immediately called his mom and said, "Guess what? Brandon's in town." Let's do it tomorrow night. Then when they showed up at the Woodruffs' house the next night, they saw Norma's car in the driveway, the one that Brandon had been driving, and assumed that he was there as well. So they knocked on the door. Norma or Dennis opened it to see what they wanted, and they were taken over almost immediately at gunpoint. They demanded to know where Brandon was because, quote, his car was in the driveway. When they found out that Brandon wasn't there, I believe their plan was destroyed. Now, Charla was going to have to split the inheritance 50-50. However, what about if Brandon is framed and convicted for the murders? Then Charla would get it all. So I believe this new plan took some time. I believe they sat around and thought about it while Dennis and Norma were held on the couch at gunpoint. However, at some point, I believe Dennis realized he wasn't getting out of this alive. Maybe the killers were talking openly amongst each other, and Dennis could tell from the conversation this wasn't looking good for him and Norma. I don't know. But what I do know is that Dennis was shot and Norma reacted. Then I believe the killers freaked out, washed up as well as they could in the guest bathroom, and left the crime scene in a hurry. Now, this brings us to a couple things. What was Charla's role in this whole thing, and what about the water in the bathroom? Remember the real big gap in Charla's phone records the night of the murders? Yeah, she definitely had time to drive to Roy City and back again, and have a couple hours on scene. One of the things that we touched on during the season is that a few of the stab wounds on Dennis, and Dennis alone, were proven to be post-mortem. That means that someone stabbed him after he was dead and his heart was no longer pumping. So if the Woodruffs were shot at around, let's say, 10 p.m. to 12 a.m., and then Charla arrived around 5 a.m., this would be consistent with the forensics. All right. So what about the water in the bathtub and the sink? Well, if Dennis and Norma were found dead, who would be the first person to know? Yep, Charla. So she knew that the morning of the 18th, her parents had not yet been found. So, given the all clear from Charla, I believe they went over there that morning and spent at least an hour or two cleaning that bathroom up. They needed to make sure that there was not one drop of blood found in the bathroom, and that's exactly what they did. All of the luminol that the investigators thought was a, quote, hit turned out to be a hit on bleach. Nothing but bleach. Now, you have to know that this theory is not just something that I dreamt up one night. It's based on the facts and the evidence that I've been studying for years now. There's just too many suspicious things that Mike and his mom did to ignore. From the very first night calling the crime scene to the next morning calling the police and pointing the finger at Brandon. Then, the way that Joe interacted with Mike during his interview, and the bizarre interview that he himself had with Ranger Collins. Even though we hired a body language expert to give us an unbiased opinion, it really doesn't take an expert to realize that Mike and Joe and Charla are all lying. They're so bad at it. And then, the creme de la creme, Mike says there's a computer missing from the crime scene. Who had knowledge of this fact? Yep, the killers and the killers alone. To me, this is enough to arrest him on the spot. No one knew this. Not the family, not the investigators, not the work people, no one. No one except the cold-blooded killers. And Mike is saying that he and his mom both knew. He might as well have just stood up and held up a sign that said, "I'm a murderer." How on God's green earth did you miss that, Ranger Collins? Absolutely disgusting. So, Charla. I believe 100% that she initiated, orchestrated, and controlled this whole thing. I believe she came from Arkansas as soon as that guy called her at 3 a.m. and made sure that everything was done correctly. I just think she couldn't help herself from stabbing Dennis because of how much hatred she had for the man. Her lies about Brandon during the second interview with Ranger Collins and during the trial were nothing more than an attempt to make sure that her brother was convicted and sent to prison for the rest of his life. That way, 100% of the old payday comes right to her pockets. Well, except for the portion that she had to share with the shitkickers and Norma Etherington. Well, there you have my theory of the crime. But I want to talk for just a minute directly to the family and friends that abandoned Brandon at his time of need. This includes his Aunt Linda, his cousin Heather, pretty much his whole family on Norma's side. You people are absolutely disgusting. When Brandon needed someone to believe in him, instead of supporting him and demanding proof that he was the one that killed Dennis and Norma, you turned your back on him and believed the demon child Charla. Do you all not realize that you got played? That the real killer was under your nose the whole time? Did you really buy Charla's innocent little girl act? Well, guess what? You are fucking disgusting. Dennis and Norma both deserve to have the real killers brought to justice. Yet you were just willing to latch onto any bit of information that you thought brought you some closure, whether or not it was actually true. Dennis and Norma deserve better. They deserve justice. And your quick leap to screw over your own family means that Dennis and Norma to this day do not have peace. They are rolling over in their graves trying to get you to take notice. They will never truly have peace, and they can never truly rest in peace as long as Brandon sits in prison for their murders. They know Brandon didn't do it, and you should have too. And now that you have all of the facts, it is your duty to join the fight to get Brandon out of prison and find a way to prove the real killers guilty. Yes, it'll mean that you lose your precious Charla, but she's had 15 years of freedom now that she didn't deserve. Step up, admit you were wrong, and help us right this injustice. All right, let me close this episode and the season with the following statements. We will be coming to you, hopefully sooner rather than later, with more true crime cases, more wrongfully convicted inmates. The format will probably be a little different though, because from the second season on, we'll actually be doing a real-time investigation. With Brandon's case, it was more just the format of telling you the story. With future cases, we'll actually be traveling to the scene of the crime and talking to the people that were involved. We'll be trying to crack the cold case wide open. And in between this season and the next, we'll be coming to you with some one-off special episodes with some very interesting guests. I hope you'll join us for those as well. All right, it has been my privilege and my honor to fight for Brandon. I would put my life on the line on the fact that Brandon is innocent. And in some ways, I have. Whoever truly killed Dennis and Norma are still out there, somewhere. And more than likely, I believe they're listening to my words right now. So if they're crazy enough to kill two innocent people, they wouldn't hesitate in doing it again with a lowly podcast host. But I don't care. The injustice that has been done to Brandon is just too horribly wrong to sit by and not do anything. This is why I say in my tagline at the end of every episode to get involved. When you see a mistake, do your best to fight it. As the great John Lewis said, quote, "When you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, you have to speak up. You have to say something. You have to do something." End quote. Ladies and gentlemen, my AJ Army, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for taking time out of your busy schedules to learn about Brandon's case and to listen to my voice. You could have been anywhere in the world, and you chose to be here with me. I appreciate that more than you will ever know. I believe that if we build a big enough army, eventually Dennis and Norma's killers will be brought to justice, and Brandon will be freed. So please remember, always stay aware, stay strong, and get involved. Goodbye for now.